What's up, everybody? I'm Jason. Welcome back to another episode of the vlog. So in today's episode, I want to talk about sort of purchasing decisions. Did planning things change, new platforms, that whole kind of thing. I'm primarily going to be focusing on talking about the RF 100 to 500. Well, before I get started on that, I should say, I received confirmation on Monday, August 10th, that B&H has shipped out my LP-E6NH batteries that were part of my order for my EOS R5. So the only thing that I have not received yet so far, or has not shipped, I won't get the batteries until the end of the week, but the only thing that has not shipped yet in my EOS R5 order is the R5 itself. That's still 2 to 3 weeks out, according to, at a minimum, 2 to 3 weeks out, according to what B&H is saying for when they expect their next shipment. And there's obviously no guarantees that I will have a camera in that shipment anyway. So it could be a long time, much further run. What got me thinking about this is sort of planning and thinking about changing in the change in platforms. I've always shot DSLRs. I do have an EOS M3, but I don't really use it in the sense that it's not a serious camera for me. I mean, it's a serious camera, but it's not something that I take out and use seriously in general photography. And there's a part of things, a part of camera gear or whatever, where you can use previous experience with similar kinds of things to infer how things will go with a new piece of equipment or a new platform. And then there's a part of it where it really just comes down to you have to try it, you have to use it. And for me, the more I've thought about it, the more mirrorless cameras sort of fall into this, I have to use it to really understand what's going on or how it will work for me. Now, I mean, part of just the thing, cameras, whatever in general, is just, straight up, it's a camera. I mean, it's not that, whether it's a DSLR or a point and shoot or the camera on your cell phone, the mechanics of making a picture, or changing lenses, or composition, all of that stuff, it doesn't really change. You're not jumping from, I do things one way on a DSLR because the way it works, and then now jumping to a mirrorless camera, everything is completely different and I have to relearn photography. That's not how it works. So there is a lot of stuff that transitions over, that translates over, that you don't need to, obviously reevaluate sort of how you do things or how things will work. However, there's a lot of things that are sort of different. Primarily, and how much this is going to affect you or this affects you really is going to vary from your, based on what you do as a photographer, your photography. So a large part of what I like to shoot, and I do shoot, is wildlife. And the way I've always shot wildlife, the way I've always approached that that subject matter, is to basically use my camera and my big telephoto lens as a spotting scope. And it has the benefit of basically enabling me to be ready to shoot as soon as something happens. So I can sit there looking through the viewfinder, watching the bear or the moose or the wolf or the leopard or whatever it is, up close, composed, ready to go, And, the DSLR, the shutter lag from basically having the camera asleep to having the camera taking pictures is minimal at best. And so, I can sit there and I can be pre-composed, I can be observing the subject, and when I see it starting to do something, I see a behavior that's indicative of it starting to wake up or pay attention to something or, whatever, I can half press the shutter release, and, if it like snaps awake and starts doing things, I can be right into shooting, like right, instantaneously. The only time I use like binoculars is when I'm looking for the wildlife to photograph. Now, in many respects, using binoculars is a heck of a lot more comfortable than using the camera as a spotting scope. A pair of 10x binoculars or 10 power binoculars will put a substantially bigger image of whatever it is you're looking for than, say, a 10x zoomed lens. So like a 500 millimeter lens would be the equivalent of 10x magnification or something to that effect. And so there's inherently a like you could call it a benefit of, in terms of comfort, of watching the situation unfold through a set of binoculars versus doing it through the camera. The problem is as the situation really unfolds and things start happening, and depending on what you're photographing, there can be, a lot of warning that something's going to happen, or there could be virtually no warning that something's going to happen. Depending on what you're photographing, that can be the difference between getting the shot and missing the shot. And so what does this have to do with mirrorless cameras? Well, mirrorless cameras don't have a mirror. They have no optical viewfinder path. Everything's done through the sensor. And the biggest sort of thing that falls out of everything being done through the sensor is everything requires power. Everything costs power. To sit and observe an animal means that the sensor is being driven, the processor is being driven, the viewfinder is being driven, or the display on the back of the camera is being driven. And all of this stuff going on, all of the computational work for all of this stuff going on, means your battery is being slowly depleted. And, this is to ignore, for example, the fact that all of this stuff produces some heat, and as it's come out with people expecting vastly more cinematography-oriented cameras in the R5 and R6 than Canon has designed those cameras to be, and therefore they run into thermal limits when shooting video at high data loads, so 8K, 4K, 120, that kind of thing, that the and the impact of temperature or thermal loading on that, reducing recording times. But the biggest impact as a still photographer really comes down to battery life, to how much time can you sit there with the camera ticking away, draining down the batteries, driving the image stabilizers, driving the autofocus systems, driving, all of this stuff, observing something. And, for me, and I'm not, this isn't to say that you can't use a mirrorless camera for wildlife photography. There's a plenty of very successful, very competent, very good wildlife photographers that have switched to or are using mirrorless cameras. This isn't to say, anything is, impossible or even substantially more difficult or something, it's just different. You have to have a different approach, a different sort of mentality, a different sort of thought process. or you have to have a different setup. You have to have more power with you. You're not going for 2 or 3 days in a very serious, high target-rich environment with one set of batteries. You know, I expect, based on sort of the numbers that Canon's published, at least changing the highest capacity LP-E6 LP-E6NH, those highest capacity batteries, I expect to go through in serious use probably 4 a day. I'll have a battery grip on my camera, so I'll be going through 2 at a time. But you know, that's kind of where my thought process is. Needing to draw, you know, needing the power means needing to burn more batteries, essentially, and needing to carry, pack, and charge, and be prepared to deal with having, you know, that increased battery load. So that raises some questions for me about how I plan, or how I will actually see the R5 fitting into my photographic repertoire. How willing or how quick am I going to be to dismiss or to displace and to sell and to move away from my DSLRs when they don't consume power, they don't have this limitation in the way I shoot and the subjects that I shoot. So, like I said, that's, you know, one part of or aspect of the question that I have running through my mind. And the side effect of this whole discussion and question and thought process comes back to the RF 100 to 500L zoom, which, when Canon announced it with the R5 back in, what was it, February or something like that, I was really sort of excited about it. It really promised, it looked like it was going to be this really nice upgrade from the 100 to 400 that is sort of my primary wildlife lens right now. And some information that obviously wasn't available when the lens was first announced has started coming out on the lens. Primarily, Brian at thedigitalpicture.com, in his preview informational piece about, because he hasn't finished his full review on it yet, but in his sort of preview of the lens, has mentioned that Canon, the lens doesn't fully support the teleconverters that it was announced with. Now, Brian phrases it differently. Brian phrases it as Canon has elected to choose, you know, to do something that they've done with the EF70 to 300 and blah, blah, blah. And the short of it is, in the past, especially like with the EF100 to 400, when Canon said the lens was compatible with their teleconverters, it meant that you could put the teleconverter on the lens at any focal length, including the shortest focal length possible. And with the RF 100 to 500, that's not the case. You can mount the teleconverters, either the 1.4 or the 2x, with the lens zoomed out to 300 millimeters or further. So 300 to 500 millimeters is the range that the lens supports teleconverters. And this is where the whole sort of thought process thing gets really complicated for me. Because on one hand, you now have a 500 millimeter top long end on the lens. And I'm going to just ignore the aperture being 7.1 or whatever. I'm going to ignore apertures for a minute, because in a lot of respects, they're not that important at this tier of things, and they're not that important for my thinking. I already shoot with a 100 to 400 and a 1.4 teleconverter, so I'm used to shooting at f8 in situations that sometimes are not all that agreeable for the lens, so or for lighting and shutter speed and ISOs. So Canon, or so on one hand, the 100 to 500 gives you 25% more reach. It's a 500 millimeter on the long end, not a 400 millimeter on the long end. Now, that's still 15% less than what the 100 to 400 gets with a 1.4 teleconverter. So the 100 to 400 with a 1.4 teleconverter would be 560 millimeters, which is closer to 600 most, technically. So on one hand, that extra the extra 100 millimeters going from 400 to 500 means that you may not need the teleconverter as often. So, you're only 60 millimeters shorter than the 100 to 400 without a teleconverter. You're getting, to bring apertures back into it. On the 100 to 400 with a 1.4 teleconverter, you're talking about a 560 at f8. On the 100 to 500 RF with no teleconverter, you're talking about 500 at 7.1. So it's a third stop faster, and it's not that far off than compared to, in terms of focal length. So that's one thought, okay, it gives you 500, and this is my thought process when I was, looking at the lens as Canon announced it. It gives you 500, you don't need the teleconverter as much or as often. The other side of the equation, though, comes out, my assumption, though, was that the lens was a, you could put the teleconverter on it and you had the full zoom range while the teleconverter was attached. And that not being the case sort of has to change, or changes my thinking about the whole thing. So I guess one of the questions that comes to mind is, and why maybe Canon was okay doing this and why I'm less thrilled about the change, is how people perceive teleconverters on zoom lenses. So, for example, if you look at the lens tests that Brian does of the digital picture, and most sites that do lens tests with teleconverters, they're a thing you put on the lens after you've reached the maximum zoom. So, for example, in Brian's tests, it goes from, just say with the 100 to 400, it goes from 100 millimeters to 400 millimeters in, whatever steps he uses, without a teleconverter. And then he puts the teleconverter on and does 560 millimeters or 800 millimeters, depending on if it's a 1.2 or 2x teleconverter. And, that's one sort of way I think, you can think of the problem, or the way you would use a teleconverter. So it's like, I went all the way out to 400. It's still not tight enough. I need more reach. I'll put the teleconverter on, and now I'm at 560, and, that's great. And, for a prime lens, that's how it is, because you don't have any other choice in terms of, it's, not a zoom. You go to, your 600 f4 or whatever, and if that isn't enough reach, then you put the 1.4 or 2x teleconverter on it, and then you have a, whatever 5.6 or f8. So that's one way to think about how a teleconverter works on a zoom. The other way to think about how a teleconverter works on a zoom, and the way I think about how teleconverters work on a zoom, is that they just multiply the whole lens. So my 100 to 400 stops being a 100 to 400 and becomes a 140 to 560, which is in fact what happens when you use a teleconverter on that lens. It's not, you have the whole zoom range on the 100 to 400 available to you when you have the teleconverter on. And so it's not just a, well, 400 isn't enough, I'll put the teleconverter on and go to 560. And then suppose the flip side of that is the subject is coming towards you. It's a, a buffalo or a bear or whatever walking towards you. The flip side of that first train of, or way of thinking, is, Well, it's too close for 560. I'll take the teleconverter off, go back to the 100 to 400, and then zoom back down to 100 with it. Now, my experience in shooting wildlife is taking a teleconverter off in the field is not a good solution. It's doable, you can live with it, it'll work, but I have missed shots because something happened in the time it took me to take the teleconverter off and cap it and put the camera back together and lens back together. It's not all that difficult to drop your teleconverter, and the problem with the RF teleconverters, the EF teleconverters, any of them, is they have very exposed lens elements both on the front and the back, and so it is not terribly difficult to drop that and have it be damaged, have a lens element be scratched or cracked. And even in the case of stowing it, what do you do? How do you stow it? I have, that I've carried for a long time when I'm using teleconverters, a think tank pouch. This one, actually, hanging on the wall behind me, and it's padded inside, and it's reasonably good, and it closes, reasonably nicely. And my thought process when I bought it was, well, because it's got nice microfiber cloth and all that stuff inside of it, what I can do is, if I need to take the teleconverter off, I can just use that pouch as a dump bag. I don't have to worry about putting caps on the teleconverter or anything like that. I can just take the teleconverter off, stick it in the pouch, and it won't get damaged. And well, the reality is as much as that sounds good in theory, in practice, because the teleconverters are $300 or $500 in the case of the RF teleconverters, I'm not very much inclined to do that. It sounds good, but that's a lot of money to be thrown away because you stuck it in a bag that had some dirt in it or something in it, or caught on something and you scratched an element. And I'm not willing to take that risk. And I certainly am not comfortable recommending that anybody else go out and take that risk. So for me, even though I have that pouch, and even though it's much more convenient with that pouch to stow a teleconverter, it's still take it off the lens, take the camera off the lens, take the teleconverter off the lens, put the camera back on the lens, put the covers on the teleconverter, stick the teleconverter in the pouch. And all of this, of course, presumes that you have the lens on a lens with a foot, and the whole thing, or the lens on a tripod, a tripod, because you really do need three hands to take, to hold the lens, the teleconverter, and the camera if you're shooting handheld. Even if you're shooting like from a beanbag, you really do need to have three hands to make sure you don't, say, drop your lens out the window of your car, because that would be even worse than scratching up a teleconverter. So the process that I've gotten accustomed to using, or that I use with my 100 to 400, is in a situation where I know that I have a subject that I'm out working at 560. I have the teleconverter on, and yes, I lose 40% at the very widest end of the lens, so I don't get the range from 100 millimeters to 140 millimeters, but I have an entire range from 140 millimeters to 560 millimeters to work with. So I have that 4x zoom range. I have the entire working range, essentially, of the lens with the teleconverter on it. So that brings me to the RF 100 to 500. You don't have that range with the teleconverter on it. You have, according to what Brian has said, 300 to 500 millimeters is the range where the lens will mount the teleconverter. So that effectively means that when you're shooting with the teleconverter, you have a 420 to 700 millimeter, I think if I'm doing the math right. You have a 420 to 700 millimeter zoom. You don't have the range from 140 millimeters to 420 millimeters. And now you're back in that situation of, this works really well if your thought process, the way you approach thinking about using a teleconverter is, well, I zoom all the way out to 500, then I put the teleconverter on to get, from 500 out. It doesn't work so well the way I work, which is that I want the whole range, because as something comes closer to me, and I've had this happen where I'm just zooming back and back and back and wider and wider and wider as a buffalo or whatever, approaches the vehicle that I'm in. And you just don't have that option. And so now you're back to the whole dance the teleconverter thing, or grab a second camera with another lens on it. Well, the thing that to me is so attractive about the 100 to 400 and the 100 to 500, really much this as well, is you don't need to have two cameras with two telephoto lenses set up on it. When I was, for example, shooting in Yellowstone and I had a 600 f4 with me, the 600 f4 was on one camera, the 100 to 400 was on the other. Because you can't zoom with a 600 or a prime lens, obviously. When something was too close for the composition to work with the 600 f4, I just would let go of it, pick up my other camera, and start shooting with that. Or, if I was in a car, put it down on the seat next to me and grab my other camera. And that's really kind of the situation. I feel like this not full range teleconverter situation has created with the RF 100 to 500. And so it raises some questions to me about sort of how this all really will work out for me in terms of using Canon's RF platform as a wildlife platform for me. Again, it's not that I don't see that, or that I don't think it can be done, or that I don't think it'll work. Or that it's a bad system or a bad option. It's just different. And it's different in a way that I find really requires me to have it and use it to really understand. I can think about it all I want, but what is it? How does it play out in practice? So anyway, like I said, I'm going back and thinking about this now and going, well, so you have a 100 to 500, but if 500's not really enough, then you put a 1.4 teleconverter on it and you have a 420 to 700, which is an impressive range. I'm not, I'm not gonna say that that's a bad range, to have, even if it's an f10, lens at 700. But then how do you back that up, or how would I back that up on the short end? Because 420 is too long for you to have a 70 to 200. So this isn't really a good, let's sort of follow the hypothetical thought process. I move from my EOS DSLRs to EOS mirrorless cameras, and I do kind of like what I have now, which is I have a 100 to 400, and I also have a 70 to 200. So I do the same thing. So I could have that, and I could go well, the 100 to 500 becomes a 420 to 700, and then, you know, do you 2x teleconvert a 70 to 200 so that it's a 140 to 400 to fill in that gap? That doesn't seem like a really good option to me. Again, because you're relying on teleconverters and you're relying on another teleconverter. Now, granted, that would mean you have a 1.4 and a 2x teleconverter, which is not necessarily a bad thing to have. But it also means that because 2x teleconverters substantially compromise image quality, that you're really compromising that 70 to 200 compared to, say, not having a teleconverter on it or having only a 1.4 teleconverter on it. Your other option would be to just use the 70 to 200, and so you would have 70 to 200 covered, and then you would have this big gap from 200 to 420, so that's 220 millimeters of coverage. That's a really big gap. And then 420 to 700, you know, I guess that would work. Not really well, I don't think. I certainly wouldn't want to work out of, you know, in those conditions or with that setup. You could have two 100 to 400s. That doesn't seem all that really great to me either, to have two identical lenses, one you're using with a teleconverter some of the time and the other lens you're not using unless you absolutely need to use it with a when the first one, like, that just seems like a lot of redundant gear. If you already have a 100 to 400, you don't sell your 100 to 400 and you keep using that, which is where I'm starting with, till I make some real decisions on RF mount lenses and whatnot. I just don't really see, you know, I would like to, if I end up moving completely to mirrorless, which sort of feels like the inevitable situation. It sort of feels like that's where things are going to go, simply because that's where they're going to go. You're being pushed around by the what sells to consumers, so to speak. Canon has told, apparently, or Canon rumors is saying, again, it's a rumor, that Canon won't be producing a 5D Mark IV, 5 DSLR. Personally, I'd be all over a 5D Mark V. Take the sensor and processor from the R5, put it in the 5D Mark IV body with the autofocus sensor and the metering stuff from the 1DX Mark III. It strikes me as a super simple sort of thing to do for Canon, in terms of there's not a tremendous amount of like re-engineering or engineering work that would have to be done to put into that, and you know, it bridges a gap that I think still exists. There's, as much as a leap as the R5 is a leap forward and it's a parity thing with DSLRs, I also feel like the R5 is still, and this goes true for, you know, everything, from Sony's gear to Nikon's gear to Panasonic's gear, you know, across the board. Mirrorless cameras are still playing catch up to DSLRs, and it has nothing to do with image quality or inability to innovate or something like that. It has everything to do with the sort of inherent physical properties of cameras, and it takes substantially more processing power and power efficiency and so on and so forth in a mirrorless camera, because again, that whole needing to constantly do all of the processing to just show you a picture, show you what the world looks like through the lens, that DSLRs basically get for free. It means using more complicated autofocus technologies and more processing going into, say, metering, than what DSLRs use, where they can use much simpler autofocus sensors that are designed inherently to make it easy computationally for the camera to know when focus has been achieved, where they use vastly simplified metering sensors, because you don't need 45 million pixels to figure out what the exposure of a scene should be. And in fact, there's a limitation that exists in Canon's mirrorless cameras with respect to metering and potentially autofocus tracking that doesn't necessarily exist in their DSLRs, which is the metering sensors in at least the 5D Mark IV, the 1DX Mark II and III, they're RGB plus infrared. And the IR gives the camera the ability to process distinct thermal differences, even if it's near infrared, distinct thermal differences between subjects and backgrounds. So a bird, for example, will not have the same temperature as, or infrared reflectance as, or emission, as a tree in the background. And so the autofocus system can use that to very easily, computation-wise, figure out that it's tracking what it's tracking and where that thing that it's tracking is moving, because the thing that it's tracking has color and it also has a temperature signature, an infrared signature. Whereas in, say, the EOS R, and I'm not saying that this makes the EOS R inferior in terms of autofocus performance or anything like that, but the R system, or the EOS M system for that matter, doesn't have the simplicity of having that thermal signature level on top of the color, etc. It does have more resolution because it's higher resolution. The sensor's doing the autofocus and the processing, and it can probably pull more information out. But again, that's trading computational complexity, which is more power consumption, versus the DSLR that has simpler things that it has to manage while still being able to track and photograph the subject or deal with the thing. So, to me, to an extent, regardless of what happens, mirrorless cameras and DSLRs never achieve parity or complete parity unless you stop developing DSLRs completely and you basically give the mirrorless cameras a many-year technological advantage. So unfortunately, this seems to be what Canon and Nikon are starting to consider doing. Now, maybe this isn't the case. The rumor mill likes to talk about now or this year, they can't really, they don't really focus in on the longer-term strategy. So, and of course, the longer-term strategies can always change. So you don't necessarily, when they're talking about, well, like right now, for example, Canon is really focusing on mirrorless cameras, and there's been talk that they aren't really doing any new EF lenses, and there probably won't be more EF cameras, and everything's going to be EOS R, not DSLR. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that is the situation in the long term. In the short term, Canon can get the EOS R system up and running and then backport some things to the EF platform, the DSLRs, potentially. Now, I'm not saying that's what they're going to do. To a certain extent, I doubt that that's really something that they will do, just because it seems in many respects to me like the consumer demand has gone new shiny mirrorless, and not necessarily always or considering the pros and cons of that change sort of fully. Now, of course, you could also argue that I'm coming at this as a dinosaur, and I'm not ready to embrace the great new thing that is mirrorless. And I mean, that's certainly, I guess, one way of looking at it or one way of thinking about it. I would tend to disagree on that, though, largely because the biggest thing that stopped me from going mirrorless has been that anything Canon produced, I didn't want to leave Canon as a platform because I didn't want to be running adapted lenses and having all kinds of quirky performance issues that just show up. But anything Canon produced up until the R6 and R5 has not really been a parody type thing to my 5D Mark IVs. And the R5 is, at least as a still photographer and also to a large extent for video, a step forward. It's a not a downgrade or a slight downgrade. It's a straight up side upgrade. Anyway, I guess since I started rambling and I'm not quite sure where I was going with that versus the talk about the 100 to 500, that probably means it's a good time to wrap up this video. I guess I will sort of, I mean, I'm going to be talking about this stuff for a while because it's a big change. It's a big change in technology. It's a big change in how, as a photographer, at least I approach the gear that I'm buying. And, you know, as I've said in previous videos, and it continues to be the case, at least until it stops being the case, but I'm not sponsored by Canon. I don't get a free ride on my gear. I pay for everything out of my pocket. And when you talk about $2,500 here for a lens and $4,000 here for a camera, this kind of thing is something I really think long and hard about because that's a lot of money. That's a lot of money to put into something and have it turn out that it wasn't what you wanted, or it doesn't work the way you wanted, or it's a big impediment to your workflow. And it's a lot of money to put into something, you know, even truthfully, even when everything works perfectly and it's a phenomenal transition. It's still, the short of it is, it's still a lot of money. So, like I said, I'm going to be talking about this stuff for a while. I will be talking about my R5 when I eventually get it, because eventually I will get the camera. You know, and then I'll have, you know, a whole slew of to talk about in terms of, you know, firsthand experience with the ergonomics, the usability, etc., and just how everything works out with the platform as a whole. But like I said, I think this is a good time to wrap up this episode. If you've made it this far, obviously, thanks for watching. You know the routine: like it if you liked it, thumbs down if you didn't, subscribe if you'd like to see more, and stay up to date with the content that I will be coming along with sooner or later. So again, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.